Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the program today is a wonderful guest who's going to be talking about spiritual permaculture. That's right, it's a spiritual approach that we're going to talk about systems, organization, and grand design, and how we can make our lives much more enjoyable and much more ambitious when it comes to our pursuits to discover what is our special purpose here on this planet. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Jan Martin Bang. Jan, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Okay, thank you for asking me.
Well, you bet. Now, I know it was an oversimplification when I came to actually describing the topic, but I kind of wanted to allow you to unfold this whole thing for us here. First of all, let's talk about what the definition of permaculture actually is.
It's a design system, which is another way of saying it's a way of thinking. It is based on looking at natural cycles, natural rhythms, natural patterns in the natural ecology, and using those as templates for designing things that we need to create a sustainable future. That's a kind of working definition. You might say it has four elements. One is that it's a way of thinking. The second is that it's based on observation of how nature operates, using that as patterns for our design. It's for designing things we need. We can call it infrastructure, which is everything from buildings to systems to governance to economics to gardens to farming. And it's designed to create a sustainable future.
Now, what was it that sort of lit you up to move in this direction with your life?
Wow, that's a long question. I grew up in the 60s, and there were certain things that we weren't really that impressed by in the world that we grew up in. Mm-hmm. There was, pollution, and there was the atom bomb, and I actually do remember as far back as Cuba. There was a war in Vietnam happening, which some people might remember. There was pollution, and there was a drive towards big is better, and if it squashes people, it doesn't really matter. And I think permaculture grew out of that, as did many, many things, as a reaction to the way that the world was going. I grew up in London, and I do remember there was a show on the stage in London in the mid-60s called Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. And that kind of sums it up in one sentence. And permaculture is smack bang in the middle of that stuff as a reaction to things that we saw that weren't really going the way we wanted it to. Mm-hmm. And as opposed to many of the reactions to that, instead of saying no to war, no to pollution, no to atomic weapons, permaculture says yes to a better future, yes to sustainable agriculture, yes to ecological buildings, and yes to creating a world where we take care of each other, we take care of the world, and we share the surplus that we create, or that nature creates. Mm-hmm.
Now, I remember my first encounter with the term permaculture was just a few years ago, and it was when I had the opportunity to interview on the book The One Straw Revolution, Masanobu Fukuoka, which a lot of people in the permaculture community are very familiar with. And what I was astounded by was, as I was reading this book before the interview, much like yours, is that there were all these insights that I came to as I was growing up, even though I grew up in Southern California, pretty much outside the city of Los Angeles, by the beaches. I still had the opportunity to go on campouts, go up to the redwoods, the sequoias. Then eventually we had moved up to the Pacific Northwest and eventually out into more or less, call it a farming community, but it was certainly out there in the country, so to speak, with woods right next to us, a river flowing behind us. And these were all places I really enjoyed being, and it wasn't just because of nature, but it was also embracing the energy. There was a certain communication and interconnectedness that I was feeling with what was going on around me, and I began to realize, I'm just part of this whole complex whole, but I never heard anybody, especially educators, school teachers, really ever talking about that kind of stuff. And so I thought, am I just a weird thinker? Or is this what it really brings to you when you have that time to be able to, I guess, get connected, as a lot of what you talk about in permaculture, a spiritual approach?
Yeah, well, I think we have to accept that some people think we are, weird thinkers. But then, that's a great community to be a part of. There were a lot of weird thinkers around who took their inspiration from nature, and really, I don't see myself in the same league as these, but I do see myself as connected with these people. If you think about, if we go back in the Western tradition, Moses went out into the desert to get his inspiration, and Jesus spent a long time in the desert, connecting with the wilderness, getting his inspiration. Muhammad wrote the Quran in a cave in the desert, and throughout our history, we have people who have gone out into the wilderness, connected with nature, and found their inspiration there. And that's right up to modern times, people who are not particularly associated with religious movements, like John Muir. I mean, he's a Scotsman, but he's definitely associated with California, with the whole nature conservation movement in the United States. We have Arne Næss here in Norway, who died a few years ago, eco-philosophy, who took his inspiration from nature. And I see permaculture as right in the middle of that tradition that, when we're in trouble, where are we going to find our answers? Well, if we go back to nature and see, how does nature solve problems? Maybe nature has some tips to give us, because we know that nature works. And I just read an amazing article just a couple of days ago about Chernobyl, and how the wildlife in Chernobyl is booming, despite the fact that, we did that, or we didn't do that, but, somebody did that stuff with all the nuclear pollution there. But the wildlife is coming back like there's no tomorrow. And somebody made a comment at the end of the article that said that, modern farming does a lot more damage after 30 years than Chernobyl has after 30 years.
Wow. So
if we just leave it alone, nature will solve problems. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that, that's our teacher. Mm-hmm. Go back to nature, see what she does, and learn.
Mm-hmm. That's such a fascinating story, because back in 1980, I believe it was, is when Mount St. Helens blew. We happened to be living in the area, or not real close to it, the day that happened. And there was a big concern about all the destruction that had happened because of this explosive event. But now, as 10 and 15, 20, and 30 years later come along, they realize this has all rebounded in such remarkable ways that even science itself at times scratches its head and said, how could we have missed this? It's just really amazing how it all works.
Yeah, I think, that's the thrust of this book. The thrust of this book is basically this, that the materialist science that we grew up with in the 50s and 60s, I all honor to the science. It has given us an amazing amount of great tools. Look, here I am sitting in rural Norway, just about coming into winter here, and I'm talking directly to you and to maybe a few other people in California who are listening. It's amazing technology we have here. Mm-hmm. If we just upgraded slightly, we could have done this on Skype, and you would have even seen me, which is not a great thing to do, but, you know, it's an amazing technology.
Right.
But it's actually, for all its amazingness, it's actually incredibly primitive, because there's a whole world of things below, behind, inside, in another dimension that the materialist science hasn't tapped into yet. It hasn't been able to crack that nut. And it seems that the forefront of science in the last decades, possibly even 100 years, has found out that when you really get down to it, it's the things between the things that are important. And that actually the things that make up this world are so small and the spaces between them so big relatively that actually things are mostly space. And not only that, but the energy between those things is so powerful that information is being passed around. And what we find is that many of the sayings of the ancient shamans, the mystics, the people who are connected to the spiritual world, reflected in our scientific discoveries over the last 30, 40 years. And so that kind of brings us back to, if we can connect with nature at a deeper level, not just at the level of how things work, but how the patterns of things work, then maybe we can find a way of designing ourselves out of the mess that we've created.
You know, speaking of natural design, I remember I was given a book called Mayan Prophecies some years ago. And what was fascinating to read about that is it was believed that the Mayan culture in building their pyramids actually created that design from the backs of rattlesnakes. And it was from something a guy picked up, you know, at a newsstand somewhere in Mexico because he was studying, you know, of course, the Mayan culture. And when you read the title, Mayan Prophecies, you're thinking it's one of those crazy conspiratorial things about UFOs and gods and everything, but it was really more about the culture and how they came to create what they did. And in your book, kind of jumping back a little bit, too, about symbiosis, we should know, most of us by now, that we live in symbiosis with the plant world. It is, without them, we just wouldn't have much of a chance at all, if any. And you also bring up The Secret Life of Plants, which was an interesting book because it talks about how plants can be intuitive and instinctive. And for people who garden especially, and they get out there and they do these sort of things, they begin to realize how true that interconnectedness is when you're working with something like a plant, whether you're growing a tree, growing food in the garden, or trying to deal with what you think are those devastating weeds that need to be killed. But you realize, you know, if I take a look at the nature of the dandelion, I realize, why kill these things when they can actually benefit me? So how do I encourage their growth rather than worrying about the green lawn, so to speak?
Yeah, you brought up two really interesting things there. One is the Mayan calendar, and in a lot of popular stuff that I looked at in the last few years, there was this thing about, the end of the world, you know, and the people gathered together and said, now it's going to end because the Mayans said it's going to end. And actually, if you delve a little bit deeper into the Mayan calendar, it's not about linear stuff like it begins, then it runs through, and then it ends.
Right.
It's about cycles.
Which is a lot of what he talked about in the book of Mayan Prophecies, and I was like, this is how they learned all these things, by observation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all about cycles, and we have got some bad habits thinking linearly, which is a whole different subject by itself. And we go back to McLuhan and the printing revolution and learning and reading and stuff. But actually, nature seems to work in cycles, not linearly. And so the end of a certain cycle was prophesied by the Mayans, which implies that it's the beginning of a new cycle. And I feel that's exactly where we are now, which is the second thing I wanted to say, is that we have for a long time thought that we were separate from nature, and that this realization that we are in symbiosis with nature, we're actually a part of nature. Actually, we are nature. And we have a unique thing, as far as we know, that we can look at nature consciously. We don't know many other organisms that can do that. But it doesn't mean we're apart from nature. It means that we can contemplate and observe it. And that we are, a part of nature. That is an amazing realization. Mm-hmm. And it breaks with the materialist scientific approach, which has this element of that we are apart from nature. We are objective observers looking at something outside us, to what is accepted now in a lot of sciences is that we are participatory actors together with the things that we're observing, and that our role is to be able to record and document and put a voice, put a name, put a word to this thing.
Now, what's really fascinating is that you also talk quite extensively, or it's in the book, your book, Permaculture, A Spiritual Approach, about a specific community that's putting this into practices. And this isn't just one isolated incident, but it's one that you talk about. That's the Findhorn community. For our listeners, describe what Findhorn actually is.
Well, Findhorn is... it's a community by default. It was never intended to be a community. It just happened to be that way. It's actually a long story. Goes back over 50 years now, and I did describe it in the book. The book came about because I teach permaculture. That's my job. That's what I do. So I always connect with other permaculture teachers. They're my colleagues. That's my world. And I have a good friend at Findhorn, Craig, and I've known him for 20 years, and we get together occasionally, and we talk permaculture. And it just so happened that one day I was sitting with him 2 or 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now, and I said, "Oh, Craig, you should write a book about permaculture in Findhorn." And Craig says, "Oh, I don't write books. That's not my thing." So I said, "Oh, okay." We talked about other things. And I was just walking back to my place. I was staying at Findhorn, and halfway back to where I was staying, I turned around and I said, "Hey, you know what?" I ran back to Craig and I said, "Hey, here's an idea. We'll write the book together. You know about Findhorn. I know about writing. We both know about permaculture." And so it started off as a book about permaculture in Findhorn. But Findhorn is a spiritual community where that space between us, if you're sitting with a circle of people, there's a space in between you. And that space is what is holding those people together. And if you are aware of that space and you can cultivate that space, you can actually nurture that space, then something happens with that group of people which is more than just the sum total of 15, 20 people sitting together. And Findhorn has spent 50 years nurturing that space and looking at that space and finding what is it that makes that space go. What does it keep it alive? And we all know there's a world of difference between going into a waiting room in a railway station or wherever where there's 15, 20 people sitting waiting for the bus or the train or whatever, and, it's not really a community. Between that and walking into a group of 15, 20 people who have come together for a specific reason to do something together. There is a tangible difference between those two situations. And Findhorn has spent 50 years discovering, looking into, researching what is that difference and how can we really nurture, how can we cultivate, how can we help that special feeling of being together become more positive, more productive. And they have evolved a lot of techniques, which we describe in the book. And it occurred to us that, that's the essence of permaculture. Permaculture, we get together, we do courses, we do projects and so on. It's groups of people working together. Well, how can we make those groups of people work more effectively? And it's not a mechanical thing. It's a thing about feeling. It's a thing about how do we regard each other? How can we support each other? How can we feel for each other? And I think that's what we're trying to get to in the book is how can we make ourselves more effective by looking at the human interactions around things.
I think, too, what really stands out about this book, besides the fact that there are a lot of interesting things that you talk about in different ways. For instance, earlier I mentioned about our symbiosis to the plant world. There's so much we could talk about there. You talk about water, water design, water flow. Then you talk about housing and building design and how those patterns can be extracted from nature to be better and more efficient than just your common going to a builder and saying, well, you've got 5 models here, I'll go ahead and take that one, but could you modify this sort of a thing? You're really connected to what's being created. Hence, the theme of the book is taking personal responsibility for how you want your world to be. And it's interesting that we seem to live in a day and an age, and I've said this many times on the program as we bring experts on, that we've come to a time in our lives that it seems we have surrendered our personal power to experts that seem to believe and that we believe know more about something than we do. When all it takes is us to take a moment, if there's a problem that we see, it's as I had as a guest many years ago say, once you recognize that a problem exists, you're automatically the solution. So the question is then, what do you do? And what I love about your book, as simple as it is it shows the complexity while trying to show how it can become simple at the same time.
Yeah, well, if you're as old as me, I mean, if we're beyond 50, I guess we're getting to that stage, right?
We sure are. Throwing the hands in the air, we're going to do things our way now. You don't know how many times I've said that, Jan, on the program where I said, it's funny that it's not a midlife crisis. It's sort of like a midlife epiphany where, most of my life I've been doing things the way I was told, the way I thought I was supposed to be doing them, and it just isn't working to me. Now, if we went out in nature and just kind of followed those laws, like a Taoist, if you will, hey, we probably wouldn't be where we are today, or maybe we would, but thinking things differently, who knows? But
Yeah, I don't want to blame the old society,
No.
I see that it's given us a lot of good stuff, and the truth is, I grew up in England and in Norway, and I had a pretty good time, actually. But there was one thing from that time that I do remember, that was think globally, act locally. And that is really one of the things that permeates, that's a good word, isn't it? Permeates permaculture. It really does go through permaculture all the way, that we have to have a high awareness of what's going on in the world. We do need to be educated. We need to follow the news. I do read newspapers. I listen to the news on the radio. I follow what's going on, but I don't get myself involved with stuff that's going on a long, long way from me that I can't influence.
Right.
But I do get involved in stuff locally. And I think that's the essence of it, is that instead of trying to change something that's going on in Korea or China or South Africa or something, which I can contribute a little bit to, but not very much, I can do positive things in my local community while raising awareness about what's going on in other places, but saying, but we can actually do something here. So we have a local group here now that's just been formed where I live. We're setting up a CSA, 2 weeks from now, we have our first meeting. I'm very involved there. I think that's great. That's what I want to put my energy into.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to see what are the practical things that you can do, and do them. Mm-hmm. There's a great saying in permaculture: do the things you can do, and don't do the things you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, oh yeah, that's smart. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
You know, it's interesting too, Jan, is that as you just talked about getting involved in community-sustained agriculture, which I think is a marvelous movement, because you tend to hear a lot of people bad-mouthing, maybe for good reason, who knows, Monsanto, you know, for their Roundup pesticides and their GMOs and all this, and you know, as I've said on the program here, it's easy to point your finger and sit passively, but remember that you've got 3 fingers pointing back at you, so you're aware of the problem, but you're not willing to do anything but complain about it. But yet with these CSAs, what's really fascinating about these growing is how a community, and it could be just in your neighborhood, somebody decides, hey, what do you say we start doing this? You get the children involved. You start raising your own food naturally and organically. You don't have to worry about sticking a label on it saying that it's organic. And you've begun to not only solve one problem, but in the long term, you're going to be solving a whole host of other problems that ripple effect from that one garden you couldn't even fathom, which is really what fascinates me the most about permaculture, are its ripple effects from doing the sensible thing.
Yeah, and I think that's the ripple effect is where it's really at. There's a great old saying, somebody told me it's from China, but it's about, if you want to change the world, if you think in terms of changing the world in a whole year, then you should plant some vegetables. You get a few vegetables by the end of the year, right? If you're thinking in terms of 10 years, then plant some trees. Trees will be big in 10 years. But if you're really thinking long term, like 100 years, become a teacher. Mm-hmm. Because it's changing people that really matters, and that's exactly what you're saying now. The ripple effect, the fact that you get turned on to organic food by somehow getting involved in a CSA, and suddenly you're in a context where there's a lot of other people who are thinking the same way. They're supporting you, they're motivating you, and I see that all the time. And that, I think, is the main thing about permaculture, is this, we have a design course. It's a standardized course that we teach all over the world, and the book is very, very much based on that design course. The chapters, are broken up into the kind of themes that we have. It's a 2-week course, so, we cover quite a lot. And I see people come on this course and they really get changed. Mm-hmm. They really get turned on to the fact that they can do things. And I think this is another great change that's happened in education. Now, I went to a British grammar school. I guess if anybody's listening here who's seen Harry Potter, you get some idea of the kind of educational spirit behind that. And very much the idea was that all these pupils, they are just empty heads, and the teacher comes in with a jug full of knowledge, and he just, fills up all the heads with knowledge, and everybody's happy. Mm-hmm. And it seems that this is the fascinating thing about the new paradigm in science, is that actually we know and we have access to every knowledge that there is. And the teacher's role now is to remind ourselves of that. And I see that every time I teach a design course, when I usually throw people straight into a design. I say, let's do a design. We choose some random things to design about, and they start doing design in small groups. And when they present their designs after an hour or two of working, they have amazing insights. Mm-hmm. And we know so much already, that we just need reminding.
It reminds me, too, I think the beauty of that is that we become the co-creators of, as people say, we are created in the likeness of the Creator, which is to be co-creating. And, certainly when it comes to permaculture, the first thing maybe a regular person might think about, and I say that because in America you tend to have a lot of self-righteous hippies. This is the way you do it. If you're not doing it this way, then you're the one that's, causing the destruction here on planet Earth. And it's like, okay, enough of the preaching already. Back off. And realize that, no, this is really a very neat thing to come to know. I mean, people love to walk through the woods. People like to go fishing. And there's so much to the essence of those things, as you were talking about, by design and flow and so forth, that help open us up so that we can come to know those things we already know, as you were saying.
Yeah. Well, that raises in my head two really important things. One is that you can get very dispirited if you think that what you do doesn't count. Mm-hmm. And usually what happens is people compare their lives to lives of great people or to global problems. Like, there's global warming, there's just been a report by, 1,600 scientists, what can I do?
Right.
And I try really hard to say to people, just tell me what you're doing, and they say, well, all I do is I grow a few herbs, my windowsill. I said, well, that's great.
Right.
How wonderful. And maybe you could grow a few herbs together with your neighbors. Share some seeds or some seedlings together. And they say, I hadn't thought of that. I said, well, try it, see what happens. And so instead of saying, growing a few herbs on your windowsill, that's not going to change the world, you say, well, that's the start of a change. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that, you were really into this about, co-creating and that we're made in the image of the Creator. We have, and I'm not a scientist, I haven't researched other animals and organisms, but I don't see it as clearly as I do it with human beings. We have an amazing capacity to think something in our heads, and it may be that there's a few, neural connections in that somebody can chart, but I challenge somebody to, chart the idea of a compost toilet in my head. Can they really find all the neural connections that make up a compost toilet? Whereas I know that I can imagine that. Mm-hmm. And then together with a group of people, I can actually create it. And this process of taking something that's in a dimension where it's a thought, which I can share with other people, you and I could sit down together and we could talk about a compost heap. And we could imagine that, and we could design it, and then we can build it, and then it exists in the real world. That process from thinking a thought in your head to creating something in the real world is, to me, an amazing gift. Mm-hmm. And that, for me, is the essence of permaculture. And I really do think that if you want to use words like spiritual, like divine, like amazing, feel free, because it really is in that realm.
You also said something that I think is so important for our listeners to really, as a big takeaway from this conversation today, is this: that people look at the scope of the problems from, like you said, the global perspective and ask, geez, what can I do? This is just too big for me. For instance, they may be the sweatshops that are, producing the underwear and the garments that you wear. What can I do about that against a big corporation that's producing these things overseas and creating these poor working conditions? And I would say, well, you could do what journalist Ann Powers, someone I met many years ago, where she buys all of her clothes from the Goodwill and the Salvation Army. And this is a person that makes a pretty good income as a journalist. And I didn't think about it then, but it took me a couple of years, interestingly enough, to realize, Well, she's just empowered herself locally, as you talk about, to say, well, I won't buy from those companies. This is the way I will solve the problem so I can go to bed at night. And the other thing, too, is, as you were mentioning about the person, when you say, well, what are you doing personally? And, well, I'm growing a couple of herbs, is they're overlooking how big that little step is. And why I say that is it reminds me of a best-selling author, Ken Blanchard, on the 1 Minute Manager. He says, sometimes the biggest travesty for many, many, many people is they don't celebrate the little wins. We're too busy looking for that big win. And that's exactly what we talk about here in permaculture. It's the little win, that one step at a time, that when you finally look back at the wake, you realize the tremendous ripple effects you have created by that simple action, one step at a time.
Yeah, and how. That's another permaculture principle says that if you want to solve problems, go upstream. Because a big river, California, you don't have any really big rivers, but let's take the Mississippi. That's quite a big river. When you get down to New Orleans, it's pretty big. It's pretty difficult to do anything with that river because it's so enormous and so powerful. But actually, if you go upstream, every big river starts with a lot of little streams that you could, fiddle about with, and you don't need a lot to change them. And so going upstream, in principle, means that, if everybody does something little, then it could have enormous consequences. And for sure, the whole thing about consumerism is if you want to make change, then you can actually use your purchasing power or your economic power to make changes, and these things do have an effect. A few years ago, there was a problem in Israel about it was called the cottage cheese revolution, and the price of cottage cheese went up unacceptably, and overnight, everybody in Israel boycotted cottage cheese, and there was a major crisis for the dairy company, and they had to put their prices down. And you can see this again and again in the world that if you stop buying that stuff, then the company that makes it and sells it, they won't actually have any money coming in. And this is kind of like a permaculture thing. I had a couple of young people who were inspired by permaculture here in Norway a couple of months ago now. They decided to take a drive holiday in their van to Portugal and back, checking out surfing beaches. But they had these principles. Their van runs on used restaurant oil, kebab oil, and they decided to get all their food from the dumpsters. So they were away for 3 or 4 weeks. They drove across Europe and back again, and they were very, very strict about this. They used a total of, I think, something like €100 for a month's travel in Europe. And they managed to live off dumpster diving and used vegetable oil for their car. And they came back and they had this great blog that they released in Norway about how they did this, and on the way they were discussing, how can we actually do something that changes things? And the whole idea of actually making sure that you can do something. And when I teach, I always say, look, it's a bit like voting. In politics, you get a chance every 4 years or so to cast a vote. But in economics, you get a chance virtually every day to cast your vote. And if you want to make change, use your vote.
I don't know how many times we've talked about that on the program as well. Hey, if you don't like something, vote with your wallet.
Right.
We seem to be so centered on money as the only way we can ever get anything, and it's really quite amazing. There was a guy I talked with some years ago as well who was taking a look at. He was sharing about how in Russia they have developed over many years the ability to barter. You know, what I have is a value, what you have is a value. Do you think we can exchange and be happy about the value that we have? And you know, America is trying to come around to that, but he says it's really interesting because if you ask most Americans, if not pretty much almost all of them, you know, can you live without money? He said unequivocally they'll say no. But and you actually talk, or there's a brief section in the book where you talk about money, and it's an interesting perspective that you share there, but one that just makes common sense almost.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is I love money. I think money's great, you know? It's a great tool. You just have to use it right. You know, it's a bit like a hammer. I was doing a lot of carpentry today, you know, using a hammer a lot. I think a hammer's a great tool, but, you know, if you don't know how to use it properly and you hit your thumb, it's really a bad tool, you know? And if you want to be nasty and hit somebody with it, you can do a lot of damage. It's not a good thing at all. And money's a bit like that, you know? It's a great tool. And one of the things that we try and do in permaculture, and I think we mentioned it in the book, is this thing about creating local currencies. Like, let's create our own money. You know, we don't actually... I think it's great, you know, we have these big currencies, you know, so we have euros and dollars and stuff, and it makes it very easy because I can actually travel around the world and it's easy for me to access money in different kinds and so on. So that's quite convenient. But clearly there are serious problems with this money, as we've seen from 2008 onwards, and I understand from the people in the know in the financial world that we are coming up to another crash quite soon. We'll see, you know, what happens. So, you know, we don't like those crashes. We don't like when those hammers fall on our feet, you know, because it hurts. So maybe we can cushion it a little bit by having some local currencies so that CSAs actually are a form of local currency in one sense, in that you create a new kind of economic system there. And there are now local currencies springing up. I mean, they've been springing up for a long, long time. But, you know, the mayor of Bristol in Great Britain, which is not a small city, it's, I think, what, 500,000, maybe 1 million people, he gets his salary paid not in sterling, but in Bristol pounds. And if you live in Bristol, you can trade a lot in Bristol pounds, and you can pay your municipal taxes in Bristol pounds. Now, if there's a crash and the sterling goes down and, you know, is not worth anything anymore because of some reason or other, Bristol pounds are not linked directly to the sterling. And so they will retain a value that the people who use them agree upon, rather than the value that people at a stock exchange agrees upon. And I think that's one of the dangers there, is that, you know, we relegate the responsibility to somebody else. I mean, you mentioned that earlier, relegating responsibility to somebody else, and then we suffer the consequences, or we say, hey, you know what, let's create something that we're responsible for, and we'll be able to decide our own stuff.
Right.
So there are, you know, that's what permaculture is really all about, is creating designs so that they will be more resilient and more sustainable, and have them like in our back pocket for when the big currencies go under. Well, it's okay, at least to survive, we'll manage. And a really interesting thing happened in Russia in 89 and 90 when the end of the Soviet Union, and the ruble, you know, totally just disappeared. It was just like a non-currency, really. And according to conventional mainstream Samuelson-type economics, people were starving to death. But actually, if you studied it, no, they found ways of getting around. They did bartering. They did a lot about bartering. And they began to create a local economy that would have sustained most of the people. And the interesting thing was, it was totally destroyed by aid west in the form of free food, which was hijacked by the emerging mafia and turned into an instrument of power. So, it's interesting, if you can get local things happening, if you can grow local community and see, how is it that nature grows from a wilderness? Like you mentioned, the Mount Helen...
Mount St. Helens, yes.
Mount St. Helens explosion, the volcano. And how is it that nature grows a new natural community? What are the phases there? We look at pioneer plants. How do they operate? What do pioneer plants really do? How do they create for the next stage of plants? How can we in our communities emulate the pioneer plants in order to create a strong local community? And their inspirations are all there.
And it's really amazing, too, to realize what you can do. Just not too long ago, I was talking with a friend of mine, and somehow we got on the conversation about spirituality and religion, and she said there was a moment in time that she actually felt like she had lost her faith. And she went on to describe what had happened is there was a restaurant she was working in, and there were some coworkers that were talking about some people sitting at a table and talking about their extreme wealth and how they like to jet set out to see, let's say, a football game and box seats and so forth. And so when she was able to see who they were talking about, she realized these were the ministers of the church that she was going to. And what sort of disoriented her was the fact that she was tithing this church and thinking, are you telling me that I'm basically funding these guys to live in their McMansion and jet set to places and have all these privileges that I don't have at all? And I said, well, there was a lesson there that you could take from that. Now, for me, I rarely ever donate any money to charity because I really can't tell where it's going. And, there's certainly enough talk at times about, for instance, you got these run for the cure, race for the cure, and the big bureaucracy around raising money for research to cure cancer, and it goes with all the other diseases as well. You really don't know where this money goes, but what I said to her, what I will do is I'll find something I can do for whatever particular charity or cause that I'm interested in, and how do I give my time to it? That way I know where that energy has went. And I said, that's a new way that you can look at things from now on. So for that church, maybe you could have went to some fundraising drives or collected, boxes of clothes or food for them. But it was a tangible way you knew where that energy you spent was going versus just donating a check. And to me, I would think that would be an essence of permaculture as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think actually personal connections are really the really important for me. I have this thing that I don't really like teaching large groups of people because I think it's really important with the personal connections. And we have a very straightforward policy in the Eco-Village network here in Norway is that we try and create opportunities for people to get together. We have open meetings and we make sure there are lots of breaks in the open meetings so that people can talk to each other. I think there's the thing about the impersonal, just give some money to charity. It doesn't really do it for me. We have a very clear thing that we've evolved here that we have a political bank here in Norway, which the guy who founded it, he said, listen, publish lists of places we don't invest in. We only publish lists of places we do invest in. In other words, we only invest in really good things, and you can check those lists out. And the interesting thing is that it gives a little bit less interest. Now, I know interest rates are not a big deal right now, but when we started using that bank 15 years ago, it said, but they give so little interest. And I said, yeah, but you know what? The money that we do have sitting in that bank, that gets used for really good things. It goes to, ecological housing and organic farming and participatory schooling and, all that kind of stuff. And so I feel, my money's doing really good work. And so I get a little bit less for it in terms of a financial exchange. On the other hand, I don't feel I need to give any money to any charity because I'm supporting, you name it, I'm supporting it.
Right.
Stuff, organic farms. So, and I feel very much that. The other thing I do is I join, I'm a member of a lot of associations that are like permaculture, organic farming, biodynamic farming association, Future in Our Hands association, all that kind of stuff. And I remember years ago, that was in the 60s, there was an German English person called Schumacher, who started Small is Beautiful. He wrote a book called Small is Beautiful, which really was one of the seminal books of the late 60s.
Yeah, that was E.F. Schumacher, if I remember.
Yeah, Schumacher College. Yeah. So anyway, he said in a lecture somewhere, he said, people ask me, what can I do to save, he was German, right? What can I do to save the world, And I say, well, are you a member of the Organic Farming Association? They say, no. I say, well, there's something you can do. Do something. And many of those things are actually quite small things. And it doesn't cost me a lot to be a member of half a dozen of those associations. But it makes a lot of difference to those associations that they have a lot of members. That gives them power. So, there's another new one that I've joined called the Smallholders Association. And I found out that this is an international movement called La Via Campesina, which has millions of members throughout the world, which are the small farmers. And research over the last 10 years has absolutely, totally established that the small farmers of the world, and we're talking about small family farms, they supply 70% of the food that's eaten on this planet. They are big.
Wow.
And I want to support them. I want to be part of them. And it's not the big industrial chemical farms that supply only 30% of the food that's eaten on this planet. Interesting statistics there.
That's just fascinating to consider what can be actually done.
Yeah, it's like we say, go upstream. It's the small people, it's the small farmers, it's the small families, and I think if we're going to round off with some nostalgic stuff, I just been reading The Lord of the Rings again, Tolkien, and who are the heroes of The Lord of the Rings? It's these small people. It's the hobbits. They're little. They go barefoot. They're actually mostly they like just sitting around, drinking beer and having a good time. They're the heroes, and I think that's not that I'm want to promote Lord of the Rings totally, but it's not a religion or anything, but. So I think Gandalf did run for president way back in the 60s once. That thing, it's the small people. And I think, if we can round off with a little bit about nature, it's the earthworms, those small little earthworms. They are the heroes. They are the ones that are creating soil that we can grow plants in to live off. And if we don't have soil, we can't grow plants. And I think you said that earlier this evening. If we don't have plants, we don't live. We are part of plants. We are plants. So it's look for the small things. It's the small things that are the solutions. It's the small things that count. And so it's also the small people that actually will make a difference, not the big people.
It's interesting because I keep thinking about author Daniel Quinn, and I had met and interviewed with him on a book called
Ishmael.
There was Ishmael, and the one that I met him and interviewed him on was a book called Beyond Civilization. And he was talking about how big civilizations always seem to have come, and then they just kind of disappear. And he says, but you look at most of these civilizations, and they're based on a hierarchical system. And he says what they need to remember is the person on top, let's say like a king, is just one person. It could be a president of a country or whatever the case it may be. But then there's all these people below on the bottom. And he says, but if they just simply walked away, there wouldn't be a whole heck of a lot a leader could do about that.
Yeah, that's right. And that pyramid is an interesting shape, because we have this, the pharaoh, the king, the emperor, the general, whatever you want to call him, president. That's at the top of the pyramid, and then all the grunts are at the bottom, and in between there's all the people who pass the orders down from the person at the top. He's always a guy. There's very few women up there, and they pass them down, and the grunts have to do it. But in permaculture, we try and invert that pyramid. We turn it upside down, and we say the important people are all those little people along the top here, and the person right at the bottom of the pyramid, right on the point there, is actually the servant. That person, the responsibility of the leader is to make conditions right so that the grunts can do their thing and develop themselves and live a good life. And I find that, when you invert that pyramid and people realize, oh yeah, that's what leadership really is. It's about making conditions right so that people prosper in themselves and together. And I think that's something that we see more and more now of the so-called leaders being, what's the word, disrobed, being revealed. What's going on in Brazil now? They're all having their fancy clothes ripped off, and they're all being shown corrupt. And good, very good, because when people realize that, maybe they'll think, oh, you know what? Maybe we need another kind of leadership here. Where can we find leadership that isn't corrupt, that wants to create conditions that are good for people?
Well, I think, too, as kind of maybe off a little bit as it sounds, it's like here in America with our next presidential race coming up, everybody's wondering about Donald Trump. So, whether he becomes president or not really isn't so important as who he is. He doesn't mind telling everybody how it is. And I think that's something that is kind of refreshing to many, many people because they're tired of politicians and so-called leaders telling us what they think we want to hear to get them in while they turn around and do opposite of what we believe they were going to do. At least Trump is just spilling it out. So that's not too bad of a thing, I don't think. Yeah.
I try very hard not to get too involved in politics. One reason is that with permaculture, it's an educational thing, and I don't want to turn people off and reveal my political connections. The other thing is that it's so easy to demonize people.
Sure it is.
It's a game that we all play. I do it myself, but I try and keep it, private. Because it actually doesn't really help very many people. And it tends to be a polarizing thing and create conflict and so on. But I do agree with you that, sometimes I read some of the stuff that these politicians say and I just wonder, like, wow, where is that coming from, really? Right now, the big issue here in Scandinavia and Europe in general is the refugee thing from Syria. And, it does make me wonder, the two countries that are right now bombing Syria seriously, one is the USA and the other is Russia. And I don't hear them big on the refugee scene, saying, well, maybe we should think about this. The connection here is obvious that, yeah, you bomb someplace and people want to leave. That's, you know, I mean, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to know that if you bomb someplace, people want to leave that place. Mm-hmm. So there is something called responsibility, and you know, I do wonder where people's responsibility factor comes in here. Mm-hmm. But I must say, generally what I hear about the local people here about the refugees, most people are pretty open and say, hey, you know, we've got to do something. These people need help. You know, we have to do something. And then, of course, always the politicians say, yeah, we can't afford to do this. You know, like and I think, wow, Norwegians can't afford to do things. We are, you know, the most verstinkende rich people in the world. You know, people complain that they can only buy a second-hand car. People complain they only have 2 cars for one person. I guess, you know, a lot of Californians are probably quite well off too, but I can't really comment much about that. But certainly in Norway, you know, there's very, very few people who are in need. And there's really a lot of people who have a lot of stuff. You know, people are running away to, you know, try and preserve their lives. Let's give them a helping hand. Isn't that what you do? You know?
I think what's wonderful that I wanted to point out, too, for our listeners here is we have to wrap it up here, but in permaculture, it really changes the paradigm of materialism, and I'm reminded of late philosopher Alan Watts. It says we really should examine what true materialism is. And in permaculture, you're part of a co-creation. You're working in cooperation with nature, and you're co-creating beautiful systems together, almost in a symbiosis, if you will, a natural dance. And it starts removing you from what, as you were just kind of alluding to a little bit, about what we think is important. Is it important to have a car to get to where we need to go, or is there an alternate way that we can do this? Bicycle, take public transportation, whatever the case is. And it's just really interesting how, as we've been talking about the whole time, all of us are a solution of the problems we see before us. The choice is, how do we want to become that solution? And that's where permaculture can certainly help point us in the right direction by getting us to ourselves to just simply ask the right questions.
Yeah. I mean, if we go back to what's the definition of permaculture, a definition I really like is that it's a series of questions that lead us into the future. And I always tell people about courses, if you're looking for answers, don't ask me. I'm just going to ask you questions. You're going to find the answers. So I think questions are really, really important. And one of the things about the book that Craig and I really were concerned about was that it's very easy for permaculture to become a kind of another technical fix. You know, it's a smart way of building compost heaps, and we can do great, you know, wastewater cleansing systems, and we can build amazing ecological houses, and so on and so on. That's great. I mean, we absolutely need it. I'm not putting it down at all. But we do need something more than just the material. Mm-hmm. Because we've been doing just the material now for 300 years, and we're really good at doing just the material, but we can see that if we just have more material, it's not going to help us. Mm-hmm. And I really do think that the idea that climate change and pollution and economic instability, and somebody said this is a moral problem, not a technical problem. I thought, yeah, that's the answer. Mm-hmm. We have all the technologies we need to do whatever we want. Now what we need is the spiritual, the willingness, the maturity to actually implement them. And that's, I think, you know, if you're going to really sum up what this book is about, that's what it's about. We have the tools, now we need to get together in community and find out how we can use them. The sustainable world is just around the corner.
It is.
It's already happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jan, I want to thank you for taking the time out there in Norway to connect with us out here in the Pacific Northwest. Permaculture, A Spiritual Approach, a marvelous book. I know that you can find it at findhornpress.com. Is there a website also people can find out more about your work as well?
Website. Yeah, it'll be on the Findhorn website.
It'll be on the Findhorn website. Very
good. Findhorn. Findhornpress.com or just Findhorn. My website, actually, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people in Northern who read Norwegian, but my website is all in Norwegian because that's where I'm working. But you know what? The truth is that with today's amazing technology, if you just Google permaculture, a spiritual approach, you're going to get this book.
Absolutely.
Coming up. So it's so easy now to get books. I buy books all the time now, and it's great.
Well, Jan, thank you for taking the time to join us here on the program today. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Okay, I enjoyed talking to you, and hopefully we might meet one day in one of these connections. Okay.
You bet. Take care. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for taking the time to tune in. And remember, the responsibility is in your hands. The choice is, what will you do with it? Well, certainly, Permaculture, A Spiritual Approach, might open up some ideas and some insights that might guide you in the right direction. Another direction you can take, visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio and also on Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.